So thank you, Farokh. Thank you, Diksha. And in absentia, thanks to Bharat Go, or we call him Bhargo, on the social media handles. Khaki, it's a real pleasure being on the same street, Shahid Bhagat Singh Marg, and having had some collaboration before. It's great to be here and to be part of this talk. So I'm very grateful. And in this rundown that Farokh brought out, I was very happy to look at two familiar names. Sanjeev Sanyal, who's been a good friend. My family finds a mention in his book, and we talk a lot about maritime history. Then I saw Mandira Nair also, who had done some work with us. So great to see enthusiasts. And on a Saturday with multiple events lined up, to see 40 screens is a tremendous encouragement. So let's dive straight into it. Uh, I want to begin by a sense of gratitude to two people, both no more with us, who have made this possible. One is the late Admiral Jayant Ganpat Natkarni, who wanted a serving naval officer to write the story of the naval contribution in World War II. And he became a very encouraging and very professional mentor in this entire venture. And then, of course, the unmatched, indefatigable Vice Admiral Manohar Prahlad Avti, the late Admiral Avti, who, of course, was always larger than life. And so these two people uh, are singular or jointly responsible for many years. In fact, nearly 11 years ago, when the proposal was put forward after having done two papers, why don't you write about uh, the naval contribution in the World War? And I had never written a book. I had uh, I had written some articles, and that was a fascinating journey. But this morning, or rather this evening, I want to begin by two more dedications. And it's a bit sad, but I want to dedicate this talk to a very dear peer and colleague whom we lost this morning after a very valiant battle with cancer. She was a revered and senior member of Academic Council, principal of Rashna College Sansad of Rashna Sansad College of Arts, and tremendous collaboration to make even our connect with Khaki possible. Uh, our collaborations with Kala Ghoda Art Festival, the collections and archives. This morning, finally, after a very valiant battle, we lost her. So just dedicate this entire proceedings to her. The second, obviously, is someone, if you get to read Timeless Wake, the narrator or the Katha Dhar of the book is none other than, you will find a character called Baba, and that's my father. 1927, August 15th is what he was born, and then he went on for his final journey in April 2016. Incidentally, 1944 to 1946 is a part of the Royal Indian Navy, and then the streets of Bombay, I heard the story for the first time as a young 7-year-old, because on the night of 15th August 1947, the trams and the trains were free. And he tells me there was that sense of festivity which was unmatched. Of course, he goes on later to take part in the Goa liberation. And so, obviously, it's to him. And this is the book. It was released almost 7 years ago. And down in the bottom picture in the center is my father, then the amazing Admiral Auti standing tall, chatting with then CNC Admiral Shekhar Sinha and Shankar Narayan, and of course the book release on the right. So I'm just setting this up because there are people who have made this possible. And so I have a very interesting canvas to cover. I am also left my contact details because I suppose you are interested in this entire field and you'll remain in touch. Those are my email IDs, both my official and personal, my Twitter handles. Please follow us. And at the end, I will tell you about a special offer on the book. So that is Timeless Wake, and it's 6:14. And I hope to wrap this up in about 45 minutes. If not, then please do raise a shout. My canvas. Now the sea is a very, and I'm going to come that later, is a very multiple, multispectral canvas. So I am going to attempt a run through of some stories. So I may skip the part post independence. So I'm going to talk about the transitions, a little bit of the World War I, an interesting story in Suez, the RIN formation, a case of a missing submarine, a David Goliath story. So great. Okay, I'm happy to have some young enthusiasts, so don't mind. That helps. And so you'll be surprised in a naval heritage story. What is this picture of three fish and okay? So let me anchor this. The fish and chips on top on the left is from a restaurant in Janpath in New Delhi. And that's to say, I did have this. This is actually, I had it. And then in Janpath is the National Archives of India, which is where I spent about 3 days trying to dig out some archives. And one of the, this is by now you understand something I enjoy having. And I think any seafarer should enjoy fish and chips. So just on the lighter note, what is on the right is the same fish and chips as a dish, but from the canteen at the Royal Museum or the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich. Okay, over there, fish and chips, of course, it would be a few pounds. And I thought that was very interesting connect. But believe you me, the fish and chips in Bombay, I think there's something special about Bombay or Mumbai. And that's I put same story, same dish in three different places, the three places that were there. So I just thought it's evening, so let's just get going. Okay, let's get on to the story. 26th of January 1950, the previous night, the royal flags came down, the Royal Naval Ensign came down for the last time on every ship of then what was called the Royal Indian Navy. On the morning of 26 January 1950, the Naval Ensign with the Indian tricolor in the upper left corner went up, signifying not just a name change from royal to Indian, but a complete journey that has been in the making for a few millennia. But finally, there was an Indian Navy. By the way, there was an Indian Navy in 1850 also. They were also called the Indian Navy. So that's the fascinating story. Before this, much happened, and my attempt is to capture some of these. In the turn from the 19th century to the 20th, there were maybe 30 to 40 centuries, recorded history of about 22 centuries, a grand maritime past, which I'm very happy that on 20th, Sanjeev Sanyal is going to come and talk, and do not miss that talk. We are co-enthusiasts in this field. India has a fabulous maritime past. We at MHS are trying to work out some of these vignettes and facets which are not talked about. In the medieval era, there was a naval presence which was spread across. Not many people realize that it was naval, not just mercantile trading. When Raj Rajendra Chola launches an expedition all the way to Vijayanagar to fight against piracy. And then at the flag end of a millennium of naval influence comes the colonial era in the 15th century with the arrival of Vasco da Gama. And I fast forward to 1892 when formally the Royal Indian Marine was established. What was the strength of the Royal Indian Marine? They were the Lashkars or the seafarers, some from northern Punjab, but many from Ratnagiri district and Konkan region and the southern areas of Malabar, because they were the ones who provided the strength and the muscle and the work and the skill sets which India richly had. So that was the phase that came. I jump forward by nearly 20 years to 28th of June 1914. And we know the story if you follow history. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. And that became the the straw that broke the camel's back. And there were a chain of lapses falling into a web of alliances. And this was co-synchronous with political unrest in India, where there was demands of freedom had begun. 4th of August, 1914, World War I commences. And do you know what? The same leaders who opposed the British suzerainty over us encouraged Indians to participate. And I think it was forward looking. And I'll cover it later part. India took part in World War I with 8 lakh troops, 47,000, almost 48,000 casualties, 65,000 wounded. Long story. But I have got, and the Royal Indian Marine was prepared to take part. 4 ships, Hardinge, Northbrook, Dalhousie, and actually Dufferin, which I have not mentioned here, were converted into auxiliary cruisers and attached to the East India Squadron. From a handful, the number of officers rose to 500 and sailors rise to 13,000. And then the Royal Navy, the Admiralty, permitted the Royal Indian Marine ships to fly the blue ensign. Suddenly, Indians were in the midst of a world war. It's called the Great War, and that took them places. But my story is not about so my story is not about World War I. My story is about a particular incident in World War I, so that we can then come on to the World War II. But just to give you an idea, this map may not be very clear on the left edge, but the Suez was threatened by a Turkish force of 25,000 troops who were approaching Suez and threatened to choke it, because if the Suez shut down, then the ships would have had to travel much more around from Europe to come to the Indies. And this was a very present threat. There was a German military advisor, Baron von Constantin, and he is the one who was driving with primarily Turkish troops. Who comes into action? The Suez was defended by 2 Indian divisions, 10 Division and 11 Division. And in the key sector, an Indian regiment or Indian battalion, 62 Punjab, was in operation. For 62 Punjab to take place, the Turks were engaged by gunfire. This is called a naval gunfire support from the HMIS Hardinge, which was again manned. The gun crews were Indian. Now, the ship was hit by return fire, but at the end of the battle, the Turks lost 192 troops, 370 wounded, and many missing. The British Indian losses were also there, but Suez remained open. Fascinating story of experience. This is even before a single officer was commissioned into any of the royal services. So Northbrook, Minto, and Dufferin continue to maintain Red Sea operations because Harding had to withdraw. Now, you would imagine that as a result of this, the entire, you would wonder that the Admiralty would want the Royal Indian Marine to grow. Sadly, as soon as the war got over and the need was no longer felt, the ships were about to be mothballed. Some sloops had been picked up, and they in the later stages of the war, and the service was in threat of being closed down. But some of the Admiralty senior officers did not agree with this. And if you read my book, you'll find a number of commission, Chatfield Committee, the Rawlinson Commission, and the various other plans which are made so that they would keep this fleet alive in the East Indies. 2nd October 1934. We remember 2nd October as the birthday of Mahatma Gandhi, father of nation. 2nd October 1934 is when the Royal Indian Navy was formally commissioned in what is today the dockyard dispensary in the naval dockyard. Just literally, if the gates are open, the lion gate is open, you can actually see across. And that's the bit of structure on the left. And that was the location where the Royal Indian Navy is commissioned. Very fascinating trivia. This should have happened 5 years earlier. But the act to pass in then Central Assembly, that's called the Indian Naval Discipline Act, failed to be passed by one vote. So many decisions get lost by one vote if you read through history. Anyway, here comes Royal Indian Navy. And on 2nd October 1934, by now there are quite a number of Indian officers. Sub-Lieutenant Mukherjee was the first to be commissioned, and they become a part of this entire setup. By the late 1930s, the world order, which had just about stabilized with the League of Nations, was moving into chaos. And on the 1st of September 1939, Germany marches into Poland. Within 2 days, based on an earlier agreement, Britain and France declared war against Germany. And in India, not a very popular choice, Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy of India, declared India to be at war. Now, that's the political setting. What is fascinating is, in the years and months that followed, Indians were in action from North Atlantic. And by the way, I am not going to talk more than this about the North Atlantic, but let me suffice to say this. A very dear now friend, a 70-year-old professor in University of Strathfield, Scotland, has been in correspondence and picking up some tidbits from the book Timeless Wake. He has updated his paper, and maybe in our newsletter of April, you'll find that article in place. Some Indian ships were commissioned in the North Atlantic, and they saw action in the Battle of the Atlantic, including the Battle of Clyde Scott and others. Persian Gulf, of course, we'll talk about. And Mediterranean, I'll mention an incident. Red Sea and East Africa, I'll mention an incident. Indians were in action in Madagascar. There's a story called The Longest Chase. South Indian Ocean, I will be talking about an incident. Andamans, I'm going to skip today, and I'll make a passing mention of Arakan. Do you see this spread, geography, the geographical spread across the entire globe? Now, mind you, Indians were found in action. And whether you talk of the later naval mutiny or the uprising, or you talk of the plans that the Navy made, many of them have their foundations in what was experienced in the warriors. And that's why I called it a timeless wake. The story of the World War or naval contribution in the World War is not a standalone story. It's a timeless wake. When a ship moves, the wake remains persistent for many, many hours beyond it. This is the timelessness of the story. Okay, I must try and pick up the pace. I want to begin by saying something fascinating about naval ships and naval people. Now, I'm going to flash 5 ships: HMIS Clive, HMIS Cornwallis, HMIS Indus, HMIS Hindustan, and HMIS Lawrence. These were the 5 and only 5 ships that the Royal Indian Navy had. 3 of them were 25 years old, and they were about to be decommissioned. Others were just about little lesser. But do you know what? Just keep this in mind. They were more than 25 years old. But more than anyone else, these were the ships. That's the fascinating thing about the maritime world. Ships have lives. We talked about Virat being cut up right now. Ships have lives which go many decades. They take decades in planning. So if you want to talk about a ship, you have to think 50 years ahead of time. How challenging. Just a thought, and I'll pick it up at the end. My first story is a fascinating story in the Red Sea, or rather in the West in Arabian Sea, if I can put it in a manner. The Italians and Italian submarines had made life miserable, or rather their presence had made a threat, life threat of the East Indies fleet. And Galileo Galilei was one such ship. And Lieutenant Bhaskar Soman, he later, of course, becomes Admiral Soman, was part of this interesting operation. One Norwegian tanker, James Stowe, had been torpedoed 12 miles south of Aden. Now, on board the Cornwallis, which Lieutenant Soman was commanding, he was in charge of the anti-submarine force. And when he established the datum or the last known position of a possible submarine, he knew that it was most likely to be the Galileo Galilei. So he was in charge of initiation of the submarine search, which continued for about 36 hours. Do you know the fascinating thing how the search ends? HMS Moonstone, which is a small boat, a boarding party finds the submarine abandoned, unmanned the next day. And Bhaskar Soman takes charge of the submarine. I mean, this can only happen in war. Okay, you can read. I've jumped a few pages of story in just a few minutes because I want to share some more stories. Presence of mind based on the contact that this is likely the submarine. How the story I've tried to dig up the archives. How did they abandon? Did they find? But they just left the submarine. Maybe they had been dropping depth charges and they came up on surface. But the next morning they found the submarine on surface with no crew. Fascinating. But that is nothing compared to the next story that I'm going to tell. This is Lieutenant Neelkant Krishnan, not the images of Admiral Krishnan, but when he was a lieutenant. Okay. He was based in Karachi and he was on board a ship. I will tell you two quick stories. I told you about the fish and chips in Greenwich. And the incident, I think it was a day after I had the fish and chips. I was sitting through the archives in the National Maritime Museum and I found a diary by a gentleman called Henry Coltham. And he was the executive officer of the ship next to Krishnan's ship. And he got some grouse with Krishna. And he said, this guy doesn't listen. What does he think? This bloody Indian, what does he think of himself? Kind of thing. That's fascinating. Okay. That's the view. That's the kind of rivalry that kind of exists. Lieutenant Neelkant Krishnan was sent, he was a young lieutenant, he was sent on a truck to Basra with a set of people. And they had taken a guide. So there were two people sitting in front and a British sergeant stops them. And he says, you don't know that you can have only one person sitting next to the driver? He says, well, I'm in charge of this party and I need a guide. And then you should be sitting behind with the bloody coolies. And Krishnan whipped out and took his pistol and told him, I am an officer of the Royal Indian Navy. If you don't let me go, I'll finish you right here. Okay, so I'm just giving you, this is a setup. And that is just with, of course, the British sergeant is very apologetic and he lets the entire team go. Later, there was a set of operations and there were Persian gunboats in Khurramshahr. And at the end on Yara, they find these gunboats had been firing. So Krishna is made in charge of a boarding party on two tugs. And he comes to the jetty on the port and he locates which was the real gunboat which was in action. And he divides his party into two, and this gunboat had two hatches. He gets, and immediately there is firing, so his people take cover and they enter from both the hatches, get in. And in the incident that he describes, there's a long story in the book is written, Sailor Story, written by his son. And I've copied that in Timeless Wake. And he gets a sense of something and he just whips out his pistol. Remember, that's why I said pistol, and just shoots. And that hits that Iranian gunboat captain. And he says, had it been a few seconds later, I wouldn't have been telling the story. It's a commando-like operation with this thing. He takes charge of the gunboats. The four of them, one of them finally sinks. He's made the senior officer of the formation. And for this action of a high gallantry in war, he was awarded one of the first and only few. There are others who got the Distinguished Service Cross, and that was Krishnan. Fascinating story of courage. And of course, he later goes on, and we know he became the commander-in-chief of the Eastern Naval Command during the 71 operations. That's Krishnan for you. This is my main story. I love the story. And I call this story the Tiger Tale of Bengal Bravery. I I have served a total of 4 years on minesweepers. And minesweepers are fascinating ships, but they are designed so that you die before the fleet gets attacked. Okay, that's the story of a minesweeper. So the Royal Indian Navy had been getting this Bathurst class minesweepers, and they decided they had to commission some minesweepers. So um, the Lieutenant Wilson is in charge of this whole story. He sails along with a whole crew all the way to Australia, and in that entire uh, journey, this is a 650-ton Bathurst class minesweeper that was commissioned. It sailed in its on 5th of November 1942 from Fremantle, which is near Perth in Western Australia. We know Perth for cricket matches, but please read the story in my book about this amazing Bengal tiger. First voyage, new crew, a gun crew which is completely Indian, and they sailed to escort MV Ondina, a Dutch tanker, on passage to Diego Garcia. What happens? And now you can't read this, but I had access to this original archives. This is the true extract typed by the captain, signed below, the true extract of the action uh, by the ship. On 11th of November at 11:40, just as it is at about 8 miles, Bengal sights a contact, and sometime later another contact. The ship assessed and the lookout assessed that these were probably Japanese armed cruisers. And so immediately the commanding officer asks the escorted tanker to steer clear and head into a distance, saying, I will engage. Now, if I take the story further, uh, a gun battle erupts. Okay, I'll come back to the part of it. So Ondina was given a rendezvous position, and Bengal altered course little to the left or to the south, increased speed, and informed the rest through signal that they were, but the range of the guns were just about 3,500 yards. So Bengal had to wait. So Bengal started returning fire, but was also conserving ammunition. And then the second raider comes into rage, that starts firing. Bengal suffers a direct hit in the forward area. And after a while later, Bengal fits, but Bengal's gun crew remain at the post and continue to fire. Now, in all this story, what I'm not telling you is Aikoku Maru and Hokoku Maru are 8,000 ton and 10,000 ton armed merchant cruisers. Bengal is a 650 ton chota minesweeper. But when the action finishes and the smoke clears, one ship was sunk and the other ship completely steamed off and arrived limping to Japan. Bengal turns and returns. Bengal's sixth salvo had struck Hokukumaro and her magazine exploded. She sank. Aikokumaro had fired on both, but there was a smoke screen. Finally, when everything clear, Ondina proceeded safely to Diego. Maiden passage of this fascinating David versus Goliath story arrives in Colombo, does major repairs, finally arrives in Bombay for the first time to a hero's welcome. There was a public reception for HMIS Bengal. And at the end of it, so that for those photographs are there. Bengal story. You know what is fascinating? The first account written by the War Office misses the story of Bengal completely. And but for the gun crew led by the leading gun crew Khan and a set of complete, there was a steward Balachandran and this whole gang. But for them, for the correct operations of the gun crew, they wouldn't have emerged. They would have just sunk there. That's the amazing story that I never can tire of. And Bengal arrives, of course, into this. This is the, I'll read out the gun crew: Mohammad Khan, able-bodied seaman; Mohammad Ibrahim, petty officer; Ismail Mohammad AB, Raghunath Sohne, AB, Ismail Baba AB, Balachandra, ordinary decksman; PK Nair, leading steward. Finally, Lieutenant Commander Wilson is decorated with the Distinguished Service Order Medal. Ismail Mohammed was given the Indian Distinguished Service Medal. Mohammad Ibrahim was given the IOM second class. And it's a story which should be turned into a movie. And I mean, if anyone is there who's listening and who thinks they have this thing, I love to share, because this is a story I can go an hour and a half on this story. I just have just picked up to say, read. This is at the center, chapter 10 of my book. And I'll talk about, I'm giving a special offer on the book. So that's another story. Okay. And I said I'll tell you a story about the Mediterranean. So remember, I said there were some ships commissioned in the North Atlantic in UK, because finally the Royal Indian Navy realizes that these number of ships are not enough. So they commission ships, they make their maiden passage, finish their workup, and somewhere around this time, the Allied forces had planned an invasion of Sicily, 10th of July 1943, under the CNC Mediterranean Sir Andrew Cunningham. And this Indian ship, Sutlej, HMIS Sutlej, sailed on 19th May 1943 for Bombay, joined the Eastern Task Force, and Jamna joined the Western Task Force. The Mediterranean was divided into the Western Task Force and Eastern Task Force, and HMIS Sutlej was a senior officer of the anti-submarine patrol. You know, the number of live submarine actions are not many. They happened, and the Indian crew and the Indian people got the experience of an operation in the middle of the operations in the Mediterranean. We know later, if you've seen the story, heard the story of General Patton and others, once this attack was successful through Sicily, then they leapfrog through Italy, and finally, that's one of the fronts that opens up into uh, the recapturing of Europe. And then I have 3 chapters on Burma. I don't even have time to tell you about how the Japanese juggernaut rolled from Japan, steaming over China, steaming over others, crossing Singapore, and the running over Burma. And the Brits had to withdraw. But in October 1942, to recapture Burma. How do I know the story? My father was in a landing craft, LCT 1101, and he used to tell the previous story. So October 1942, he of course joined a few years later, but he told the story as he received. October 1942, the landing craft wing had been set up in now present-day Vishakhapatnam and in Bombay, place called Machimar, which is not where is Machimar today. And then what today is HMIS Hamla near Marve. So the flotilla operations were initiated up to March 1943. Finally, in October 1943, Royal Indian Navy flotillas moved up to Arakan for an assault operation that went on all the way to March 1944. And then that in the next season, because in the monsoons, both the Chuangs of Burma are unnavigable, nor can these flat boats manage. 8 amphibious operations were undertaken. Finally, Rangoon falls on 2nd May 1945. The entire story of the fall of Burma, fall of the Japanese had reached almost Kohima. So you've heard of the Battle of Kohima, but this is more fascinating. Unsung heroes, young lieutenants, young petty officers, young Indians who took part. So why I talked about somewhere around 45, my father was in an LCT and they were about to sail, and then later they came to know that Japan surrendered, and of course he was sent to the Suez to get back some tanks. So he was on one of the ships. So Burma operations, fascinating journey, fascinating story of uh, operation after operation. I tried to piece together as many pieces, but uh, I had to trim it down to about 3 chapters, and it tells a very interesting story. Most of my stories are over, uh, but I'm going to, my entire purpose of this, I can't run through the entire operation. I will talk some things in a more generic sense. This is an internet-based picture of the sea, but I have seen the maritime world in many more myriad hues. The number of colors I've seen at the sea cannot be described, at least by me. The maritime world has multiple frames. We just know some frames, and the sea gives many learnings. Now, all of us may not be part of a naval operation. Many of us will not even be part of a maritime operation. Some of you only may be lucky enough to actually do anything more than a boat crossing. But the sea is a fascinating canvas of learning. If I may be permitted to talk about whether it is any faith system, I read the Bible. So in the Bible, there is the creation accounts talk of chaos and disorder and God bringing order by settling the sea. The sea, many times looked in certain texts in a very disparaged manner, is a fascinating story of culture, connectivity, community, and contestations. This is just a trailer for us. This is just a trailer. What I want to present before the people watching. In fact, I said I'll go until uh, 7. I'm going to, this was intentional. I'm going to wrap up because I want to add some more time. But I want to spend time in this. The last chapter of my book is called Living Legacy. And I want to talk about 4 lessons. I'm going to take a few minutes on this. The 4 stories, 4 lessons that come from this entire story. And in that, I will mention some things about the present day Navy or the last few decades. That first legacy is geography. We are so north obsessed. Who came through the north? Who came through the northern passes? What about the Himalayas in the north? What about the northwestern? What about Porus? What about all that? Who's going to talk about east, south, and west? India is a peninsular nation. I don't want to do this. I did with some students. Look at Google Earth, turn it around, south side up, and you'll find a W with a prominent Indian Ocean. A dominating feature of Indian Ocean is a geography of India. And like a W, it dominates the Indian Ocean. Indian Ocean was called Indian Ocean only in the 18th century. It is not India's ocean, but the Indian landmass is one of the most prominent geographical features on this. So we must look east, which we had a millennia of connection to the east. If you go to Bangkok airport, you'll find the story of Samudra Manthan, an Indian story in their airport. Go south, story of Bengal. Abhilash Tomi had an operation 1200 to 2000 miles. His rescue operations, we have been there. I had the opportunity to go to South Africa. Go west. We were there all the way to the Atlantic, the Western Arabian Sea. The West has been the venue of continuous Indian naval deployment since 2008, and Indian Navy, along with a few navies, have been reason for stability. But to those who are listening today, can I ask you to open Google Maps? Can I ask you to open the Atlas? Can I ask you to tell your children, my father gifted me a globe when I was 7 years old, and I have not stopped being fascinating. I am an advocate of maritime geography. Will we learn our geography? We have islands to the west, we have islands to the east, we have other nations, we have collaborative components. Will we? Geography is not a standalone lesson, it's a lesson that connects everything. I was with a class in Mumbai University, and I had to ask, I was talking of South China Sea, and I had to ask them, do you know where is South China Sea? And fascinating us, they at least got it right. Okay, geography. Let's be aware of our geography. Let's understand geography. And let's take charge of our geography and not just the north. So that's the first. Second is seafaring culture. So if geography is real, you have to say India is a seafaring nation. History also says it. And I've written these three words: blood, muscle, and brain. People have sweat and poured blood, lost lives. Every lesson in seafaring and nautical terms is written in blood. Because someone lost their life, a safety practice is made. Muscle, you need to tend to the ropes. It's demands when you do sailing, when you're put to the oars. And that's why seafarers used to be shanghaied. It requires muscle. But people never underestimate the amount of brains that you require. We are in a process of translating something called Malamni Pothi, the Kutchi navigators, which carry a tradition of a few millennia, and the fascinating accounts how they, before the chronometer was discovered, before longitude was made, how they did. The naval participants in the World War carried their learnings from the World War into planning the modern Navy, and that's why indigenization, and we are building ships long before Atmanirbhar Bharat was even talked about. We have learned a lesson. We have acquired a lesson. Seafaring enables you to stay alive, because when you are at sea, you are not doing class on geography, class on history, class on maths. You need a class on everything. Seafaring is a place where you need a multi-dimensional, multidisciplinary place. Spectrum of operations. One side you had anti-submarine operations, carrier chase operations. HMIS Godavari was there all the way in Madagascar. And you have blue, we call them blue water operations, go deep into ocean. But the other side, they also were operating in Burma in the Chuangs, coastal waters. Bombay has had its 2611. We don't want another. So today, the Indian Navy, in collaboration with the Coast Guard, the Marine Police, the state governments, we had an exercise called Sea Vigil. Today, there is an awareness. We are participating. Coastal communities are an essential part of our operations, because the sea requires everyone. And that's a learning that we have. We must look deep ocean, but we must never disregard our coasts. Go and visit the coast. It's a good tourist venture. It's a learning venture. It's a history venture. It's a support venture. Finally, vision and purpose. And that's my real story. Why did I write this book? Why am I so much of an advocate of what we learned? What was learned through millennia, what was inherited in our seafaring genes and acquired by Indians, even with the royal masters, but with that experience, was channelized by these young lieutenants, lieutenant commanders who suddenly were made commanders and captains, and they designed and envisioned the Navy we have today. Some of them who were in the merchant Navy, those experiences have made the merchant Navy of today. Our experience, we need to work to the maritime medium with vision and purpose. Ask the what, why, and how. And from the sea, you can apply this to our lives. So that's my part. I'm almost done. I have just a couple of slides. And so this is the book Timeless Wake, 330 plus pages. I had 1,000 pages of content when I finished a 3 years assignment to write this book. Today, I'm inviting you, come join us to enhance influence for greater maritime consciousness. If you have loved the story, if you want to be a part of more, if you want to learn, you tell us what you want to learn. You tell us what you want to do. I've put an email ID called meghdoot@mhsindia.org. My partnership consultant, my main person, Leora is there. She will answer to you. Tell us why and when you want to enhance your influence. Even if you are not in the maritime domain, you are just in corporate leadership, you are in academics, you are in any field, we can share stories from this which will help you grow. Write to us. Be a part of us. Come and pick up this book. Then, of course, as a special today on Amazon, if you go to the Amazon, the book is available for a special sale. We decided to do it on the day of the Khaki talk. So it's available for 1 week. Its price is $950. By the way, $950 doesn't even cover the cost. It is one of the most underpriced books over there. You have a look at the book, you will understand. And before I close, if nothing else, support us in our initiative. We are involved in research. We are involved like Khaki, and that's why we are partnering in some of these activities. We are involved in museology and archives, maritime events, courses. We'll be happy to customize things to your requirement. Follow us on our handles, Facebook, the web page, the Twitter uh, is part of it. And if nothing, just go to a website. And if you go to a website, on the home page, the sliders will come. Click when you see this image, you will see a fascinating 35-minute video of all that we did through the lockdown. Okay, so that's all from me, and I think I've stuck to my promise. Finish 5 minutes early. I love to do this. I don't like going over time. So Farooq, all yours. I'm available for anything further.
Thank you, Commodore. Your passion is very infective, if I may say so. There are a few questions, but I'm going to selfishly begin with one of my own. You mentioned the Bengal story and that it was missing in the archives. Was that an oversight, or do you believe that was intentional?
So, being very honest, I would not want to call it an intentional oversight. I've tried
Uh-huh.
to ask this. So, there are three accounts of the Royal Indian Navy in World War. The first is by it, the chief editor was an Indian, Bishweshwar Das, I think. And there was a Lieutenant Collins, instructor Lieutenant Collins, who wrote the account. I have a doubt that they were not too bothered about the Indian contributions much, and that's my guess. And somewhere in the middle of the war, the naval headquarters shifted from Bombay to Delhi, because by being in Bombay, the flag officer commanding Royal Indian Navy was based in Bombay, and he would miss out on all the budget, all the good things. So he moved to the corridors of power in Delhi, and
Okay.
I have a feeling in some of the transfer of the documents, possible that the War Office missed out the story. That
Uh,
would be the positive. But conspiracy theory can always be implied. By the time Commander Hastings writes the story based on the RIN journal, that means
mhm.
there was an RIN Officers Association. I found their archives in Greenwich, and in that, finally, Bengal story gets a mention. So I was very determined when I was putting through the book. I said, anywhere there is an Indian, I'm going to, double check and put the story. So I think Bengal story epitomizes everything about the sea. So, I mean, that's my take on it.
So, were you able to interview any people who actually saw the live action, or were they written accounts, or their descendants, or what?
So here is what I followed. I took this idea from some other studies. For any story to be put in, I followed the principle of double mention, that I had to have two different sources corroborating the story. That was the research methodology I followed.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, the only people who saw action that I could talk one was Admiral Avti himself. Admiral Manohar Avti, I had a 3 days interview with him, and suddenly I realized many things I was doing was I needed to recheck and do. So he faced, but I interviewed a few. So Vasu Kamath would tell me stories about, how he was in the Atlantic and how he's in charge of the middle watch. So there were a few people, but most of other people, sailors and all, who saw action, I mean, unfortunately, no. My father, of course, was some limited, the attitude and the perspective he gave. So these are 3 4 people, and I was fortunate enough to even meet them and encounter them. That's all. Otherwise, it was mostly based on archives.
So I think Om's question has just come in. I think it's related to the Bengal story, I think. He says 650 tons compared to 10,000 tons. How is that even possible? What was the secret of Bengal's success?
So absolutely fascinating. So when you just look at it independently, rationally, it doesn't make any sense. It didn't make sense to me when I first read it. Then you realize that is where at sea tactics and strategy, operational strategy and tactics make all the difference. He did not present even a target. For the other ships, he was just a thin sliver, and he separated the larger vessel away on Dina. So he comes in, and the larger vessel, which is bigger but is also easily spotted. So he waited for them to come in range and launch. And his ability to dodge, his gun crew was much better. Probably the armed merchant cruiser, the gun crews may have been someone who had just learned, and maybe the stuff was there. And the rounds fell on the ammunition tank of Hoikuku Maru, and that exploded. Now, Bengal also had a hit on the aft area, but they were able to get their repairs done and get. So at the end of it, it's not the platform; it is the ordnance must land on target, and it could have gone the other way. But then these are not the only stories. Size doesn't always matter. Sometimes tactics and strategy, correctly positioned, can deliver victory of an unmanaged. That's what happened in 71. Ordinary missile boats, which people didn't even wreaked havoc. So very common naval story. Size doesn't matter.
So Girish's question is in connection with the Indian mutiny, the naval mutiny. He's asking you if that was a direct consequence of the INA trials. And do you agree that the British left, or they hurried their departure because they could no longer control the armed forces? So there are two questions really over here.
Yeah. So let me tell for the detailed account on 17th and 18th of February on the Platinum Jubilee of the Naval Uprising. MHS is hosting a 2-day academic seminar in collaboration with Mumbai University. We will coming week put out the promos and others on it. So that will give more detail. Short answer, there are multiple accounts. Pramod Kapoor of Raleigh Books has been studying for last 3 years. He also comes up with certain INA. Sanjeev Sanyal also believes in the connection of INA. My personal take based on three sources. One is extensive interviews with my father. By the way, my father was formally called to Castle Barracks, handed over certificate saying discharge with disgrace from His Majesty's service. And my father, if I give this in Malayalam, Nada Ninde certificate. I mean, what it means here, take your certificate, he tears it and throws along with the other 4 people. I mean, the craziness of 20-year-olds at that time. I mean, that part of it. No, so what he told me is the primary reason for the mutiny was as long as the war was in progress, the British officers and the Indian sailors worked in harmony. The war finished, many of them was part of the Royal Naval Reserve, and their demobilization was going too slow. They were getting bugged. Many of the promises had not been put. There was an upscale of recruitment during the war. Promises of permanent absorption were not happening. The process of demobilization were going so slow. There were food complaints. They were being given what is called a thin dal and bread. Okay, and quality of food had dipped. Prior to the uprising in November of 1945, there was a special commission set to probe this. By the way, this is the final mutiny. There were many small strikes and uprisings all over the military and police, but this is timely and big. The INA story people have connected. My personal account is because someone wrote the word Inqilab Zindabad, and that was also used in INA. People kind of connected. But I will tell you from BC Dutt's account, even though he later shared my father's account and a few others, they just happened at the same time. They were aware more than Indian INA contribution. People who had seen the world and recognized what liberty and fraternity meant. Now, when they are mistreated, and by then the Indian independence movement is on its final stage, obviously, after a while, he won't take it. As a mutiny, never forgivable. That's why when we are coming up for this uprising, you can commemorate it, you can never celebrate it. I mean, a mutiny can never be celebrated. But at that point of time, in that setup, in that point, in fact, many of them have said, given circumstances, and if we go back in time, we wouldn't have wanted to do it had things been different, but they had been driven. So there is one chapter on the uprising in my book, the unpacking and uprising. And my father was never thrilled about the idea because he cherishes the stories of the sailings more than the uprising. And so that is the fascinating story, but it happened. And the other part that you ask, or Gopal asked, is I would agree. This was the last straw that broke the camel's back. When the police was in doubt of turning, when the military was no longer at the side, what many people don't know that January 1948 was supposed to be the independence transfer of power. The uprising hastened the process, and literally Churchill and others just get rid of these guys. And that's why you have this Radcliffe line, hastily drawn lines, thick sketch pen, lines passing through houses. I mean, in some manner, they realized they couldn't stay any longer. Many other countries, colonization finished much later. This is much faster. So I agree it had a role in hastening of independence. It was not by itself. Most important part of the story is the synergy they found with the mill workers in Bombay who were
Yes,
also exploited. And
correct.
the streets were filled not with naval ratings, but with ordinary citizens and workers of Mumbai in those stories. So, I mean, I don't want to share off all the stories. So you can be a part of a uprising seminar on 17th and 18th, and you'll get more.
Commodore, when did women start getting inducted into the Navy, both at the officer as well as at the sea seamen, if I can say the word,
Seafarers, sailors, okay, yeah.
seafarers level?
Uh, So a lot of people don't know about this. And in our last conclave, it's there on our website. At the National Conclave, we had a full session called Women in Indian Maritime History. People now know about the story of Rani Abakka and before, but I'm not going there. Let's talk of RIM and RIN.
Yes.
In RIN, there was first was the Women Auxiliary Corps,
Yes.
which had women in the forces. Then you had the Women's Royal Indian Navy, REN. Now, REN came from WREN in the Brits, and we had Women's Royal Indian
Britain.
Navy.
Yeah.
In our image caption for the conclave, we had Kalyani Sen. She was a second officer. There were a number of women, and they did a number of jobs, including signal duties, crypto work, and fascinating pictures of them in saris with ranks climbing the ladder, vertical ladder, and going up on that. So actually, that's the first place where there are proper officers. Of course, in 1992, all the three armed forces, the Army, Navy, Air Force, opened up their doors to first starting with a few branches. As of now, the Army has announced plans for certain sections of the below officer cadre to be open to women. The Air Force and Navy have not yet, they are being planned. It's a part of the process. The current journey has been from somewhere from 1992. Many of them have retired, and Rajeshwari Kori, one of them, who's one of the first in this season to sail, was also part of the seminar. So if you go to those accounts, you will find some fascinating things. So that's the timelines.
So sorry, I have a personal interest in knowing more about the Wakai. Was Wakai common to all the three branches?
I haven't dug more than the story of the WRIN. I got a few stories. So I will need to check more. But Wakai was the kind of a parent force under which then the WRIN was formed. And WRIN, one of the HMIS Feroz was in Malabar Hill, today's Malabar Hill, and they underwent training. They did a lot of fascinating work in signals and crypto and many other support services.
So is it correct that Feroz was at the site of the current WIA club?
I believe so. I have not had a confirmatory account.
Okay.
I just know it was in that general area. I mean, they more. I mean, as I said, I am not an archivist. I know what I know, but you are probably right.
Okay. There's a question about the next question. One second. Yes. Were the Royal Indian Navy fighting with INA in the Japanese occupied Burma? And what was their attitude towards each other when the war was over?
So during the war, there was no direct engagement between the RIN and INA. I can say that because I have probed both the accounts in the Andamans where the Japanese had occupied. Though the Japanese had occupied, all those accounts of Netaji transfer a submarine was independent. They didn't come into that, happened separately. In all the operations of RIN in Burma, they didn't run into they only ran into actual Japanese soldiers. So if INA had crossed, I think they had crossed over even earlier. So I have not come across any archive or recorded of a direct one-on-one action between the two. What was the attitude in terms of things? If you ask, was there a Nepal type of kind of story where the people who were fighting were later absorbed in the army? That situation, I think, didn't happen. Political level, there must have been something, but there was no encounter or approach. I think they didn't come across each other. That is my account. maybe there, if someone has any recorded archives of it, I would probably revise my view if I see that. As per my approach, it didn't come up, at least in the naval fraternity. It never came up as a collaboration or a part. They followed the independent. The focus of the initial days of the Indian Navy, even before Republic was announced, was how to build a strong navy for a future India. So in that sense, manpower was never a problem. It was how to get assets, because if you know, assets got divided between Royal Pakistan Navy, Royal Indian Navy. Most of the gunnery sailors were from there. Most of the communication sailors were from south. So some skilling had to be quickly done. Training establishments that itself was occupying a lot of attention. So I haven't come across any accounts. Maybe some academic studies may reveal in the future.
So two questions emerge in my mind. Are there any documented stories about officers and sailors from the Navy crossing over to the INA?
Not to my knowledge. Now, in fact, no, I haven't run across. I have not actually. I have not probed the other side, if anything, on the army side were there. But I don't think those were in active service, to my knowledge, did across. In the naval stories, definitely no.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you mentioned about skilling between the Pakistan Navy and the Indian Navy. After independence, did we collaborate and share
No,
knowledge, resources,
we
etc.?
didn't need to, because the only major establishment that was in Karachi was a gunnery school.
Okay.
But then the gunners were already here. The officers, see, the officer the distribution was fascinating. And the naval dockyard was a site of the initial schools before Cochin was built up. And they were already officer training, rating training schools. So it was just a matter of time. The training source was common. And
Okay.
right till about, I think, 1950s, there was a lot of training still being done in Dartmouth. And both for the specialization courses, RIN officers still went to England in the initial years. Then in the transition, there were still British officers who remained in the RIN and in the Indian Navy, the first two chiefs. And so that transition was quite well done. And they had time. I think they knew partition was coming. And from 46 of to 1950, 1955, they had sufficient time to make their plans, the plan papers. Preparation for partition was well early of its time.
Okay. We have time for one last question. Would anyone like to ask one last question? They can unmute themselves and ask Commodore.
Somebody mentioned about book not on sale in Amazon. No, I just go. In fact, if you just write to us, we'll give you the link. If you search Timeless Wake or search Maritime History Society, you'll get it. And on the checkout, they apply the discount. So if you find a difficulty, just write to us. We'll help you. No, it shares 950, but when you check out, the price drops to 800. That's some Amazon's method of applying seller discounts. So it will finally be at 800. And if you just come across to us, you'll skip you'll still get charged the same, but we'll save the Amazon discount. But no issues. Take it from Amazon.
Next question is from Gary. He wants to know, when did India get its first Indian Navy chief?
Yeah, so that story is very clearly about R.D. Katari. Admiral R.D. Katari was. I'll just get you the exact year. I am a person who goes by content rather than years. So uh, Admiral R.D. Katari was the first. 1 minute. Somebody else who is more crude up on numbers might beat me to it. But
98.
yeah, yes, Janvi?
1958, sir.
1958. Thanks, Janvi.
Thank you.
1958 is when he takes over, and that becomes. And then, of course, there's a series. Initially, their ranks were vice admiral. When the reorganization and the restructuring happened, then the rank was increased to a full rank of admiral. And so that was it. So that was the first naval chief. And incidentally, Admiral Katari was ship number 1 on Dufferin. and Dufferin was a common training ground. Admiral J.G. Nadkarni 776, I am 4641. Before the Navy, I was on T.S. Rajendra, so some common legacies. Great.
You mentioned about the riskiness of serving on minesweepers.
Minesweepers.
Why are they supposed to be risky, Commodore?
Very simple. The one who the bomb squad guy is the one who takes the first risk. So minesweepers have, supposed to be magnetic proof hull and stuff like that. But if there is an explosion, the minesweepers go out first to clear any possible mines. So you are in the harm's way, and you can afford to lose a small minesweeper along with its expendable crew rather than risk a larger fleet. I mean, just lightening the point. But that's the point. And they, because of the nature of their hull, you don't want them to have a strong magnetic signature. You have hulls. The smaller minesweepers are even made of fiberglass or special hull, and so they stand in risk, much higher risk, so that the bigger assets are kept in manner. So serving on them are risky. Minesweeping operations are real test of seamanship. I've been there a long time, so I can tell. Or if you read Kane's Mutiny, more than the mutiny part, if you look at all the seamanship evolutions which happen over there, are fascinating. Just fascinating.
Shanaz wants to know, are mines at sea still permitted? Because
Totally illegal, but who do you stop? What if someone says, and that's fascinating in today's warfare, you don't have to drop a mine. You just have to announce, I have dropped 10 mines here. Now you can't take a chance. You have to sweep and clear the area. So that's called psychological warfare, can also happen. And don't forget, in Red Sea, in the Gulf, there was a time when the tanker wars in the 80s. Somebody had kept floating mines were put in the peak of the Iran-Iraq conflict. And a lot of ships lost their lives. Operating merchant ships in that area had higher premium. So mines may be very ancient technology, but it is part of asymmetric warfare. It still risk exists. It is illegal, but you have to catch the guy who does it. No, you still have to tackle it.
Raghu's question is, does the Navy and the coast, do the Navy and the Coast Guard collaborate? And how do we make sure that our coast is safe from elements such as 2611?
Okay, fascinating question. Um, there was no Coast Guard prior to a certain period in the 70s.
71, I
Yeah,
think.
71, Admiral Basu Kamath was the first Director General. Coast Guard was carved out of the Navy because it was felt that, like the BSF, you needed a paramilitary force to undertake primarily law enforcement missions along the territorial waters, contiguous zones. That was the origin of the Coast Guard, and including help like pollution. So they have specialized in disaster relief operations, anything to related to contraband and economic offenses, and that was the entire part. Uh, Even before 2611, the concept of marine police had come, because I remember one of the IG police in Tamil Nadu had talked about it. But post 2611, the respective commanders in chief have been made the head of the coastal security operations. So when there is even before that, during a war, the Coast Guard is placed under the Navy for that purpose. Today, the apparatus is very, very clear. Up to a certain distance, I'm not getting into the distance, the Marine Police is there. So both the Coast Guard, the Navy, in fact, most of the training is done by Navy. Coast Guard is in very close communication with them. The Marine Police is skilled up. They are supposed to handle a lot of activities. Close course, most of the challenges are law enforcement challenges. Some illegal entry, like an immigration issue, or a fishing vessel, actually a illegal vessel masquerading as a fishing vessel. So law enforcement part. Then up to a certain distance, the Coast Guard comes in, because there could be economic offenses, other petrol offenses, and then a certain distance, the Navy comes in. But when an operation has to be done, these divisions are purely divisions. They all work with each other. Most of the Coast Guard training happens in naval training establishments. Our operations, the multi-agency center at Delhi, which gathers all the intelligence, they are all collaborated and shared. So the functions are distinct, but the medium is the same. And unlike land, at sea, divisions cannot be very ironclad. You can't draw a line and say, here is there and here is there. It doesn't work. So any seafaring, any maritime agency is inherently a collaborative agency. So the overall responsibility is with the commander-in-chief of the respective command, but specific tasks are assigned. For like, though the Coast Guard looks at the coast, offshore platform security is again with the Navy, a specific wing of that. So there are special vessels which do that. So it's a, if you get into the nitty-gritties, it's quite a complex structure, and there are protocols in place. There are collaborations with oil industry, with the oil platforms, with the coastal states. Each coastal state has a maritime board and has a maritime police infrastructure. There is, it's quite a very elaborative structure that is in place. I'm not saying we will never have an incident, but like 9/11, TSA says never again. And I can tell you this, I have been part of a couple of exercises in the planning. Post 26/11, even in structured exercises, we have found it, they find it very difficult to break through. Someone gets caught, not only because the maritime security agents are alert, suddenly the community is alert. Today, we have much better collaboration with the seafaring community, with the fishermen. You know, the same Machimar Nagar through which Kasab lands. Today, I remember a year and a half ago, there was a threat, and I saw the cop sitting on the macha, and his eyes actually had a different feel to it. So I think somehow some change has happened. I mean, this doesn't, if you're not there, you will not realize it, but it may not be perfect, but it is definitely quite better. So it's a much better setup.
Thank you so much, Commodore. We reached the end of our questions. It was fascinating, and I think your passion, I'm sure it must have infected a lot of people to become members of the society. If you don't mind, there's one more question.
Can the Navy prohibit the news media from flashing details and things? I so I have a counter question. Who can control the media? And 26/11 was a good period. Today you have an age of fake news, paid news, and post truth. You know, so I think self-regulation. Let me say, I along with a few people, we have worked on a strategic communication. I have genuinely a lot of people we converse with in the media. There is a much better collaboration in non-incident times. Information is shared. I think the mutual trust is much better than before, because when an incident happens and we say, can you hold on this for a while, most of them, I would say, let's say 90%, one odd rogue will be there, would heed that for national interest. And then what we sufficient information, it's a journey that we are learning. Still someone will go and flash some news because of breaking news syndrome. But I think there is a much better synergy than that existed before. We have something called a defense correspondence course. I have conducted one. My friend Shrikant Kesnur and Commodore G. Prakash, Commodore Kesnur, we interact a lot. They share about information which is there. So today, at least the military, all the three wings of the military have a much closer communication and integration which is there. So something may still happen, but at least we have much better collaboration. At the end of it, each person will protect their turf. So that may happen, but broadly.
So on that nice collaborative note, I think we should say thank you. Thank you very much, Commodore. It was really...
Thank you, Farokh, and thanks to Bharat also. We've got a lot of work together, and to anyone, the invite is absolutely open. Just write to us.
And thank you, everybody, for attending. Look forward to seeing you at our next talks. Good night.